The morning of July 12, 2005 began the way most midwinter mornings begin in Auckland's southern suburbs. Cold air sitting low over the hills. Streets still empty. The kind of quiet that makes a city feel like it belongs to nobody yet. A man walked his dog through Waikowhai Reserve, the same way he probably had dozens of times before. Waikowhai is the sort of place that feels familiar and safe in daylight, native bush pressing close to the footpaths, the faint smell of salt from the Manukau harbor below, the distant hum of the city waking up somewhere behind the tree line. He walked the path, let the dog lead, breathed the morning air. And then the dog stopped. There was something off the path. Down the slope, half hidden by the bank, partially obscured by vegetation. At first glance, it looked like rubbish. People dumped things here. Everyone in the neighborhood knew that. Mattresses. Old furniture. Broken things that no one wanted anymore. So at first, maybe he didn't even break stride. But something made him stop. A red tarpaulin. A yellow raincoat. Black plastic bags wound around something, around someone, that didn't move. He didn't need to get close to understand. Some things register in the body before the mind can form the words. By the time police arrived at the scene, a cordon was up, and the bush that had always felt familiar was suddenly something else entirely. Investigators worked the slope, documenting what they found. The body was that of a young woman. 22 years old. She was in a state of undress. There were injuries to her head and neck. She had been wrapped carefully, or hastily, and rolled partially down the bank, as though someone had been in a hurry to get rid of her. As though someone had almost been caught. She was found just 1 kilometre from her home. Her name was Katrina Jefferies. And in the days that followed, one question would cut through everything the investigators knew, everything they didn't know, and everything that still haunts this case nearly 2 decades later. What happened in the 48 hours no one saw? Before we go any further into this story, take just a second and drop a comment below letting us know where in the world you're watching from. We genuinely love hearing from you. This community is what makes this work worth doing. And if you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new case, and share this with someone who needs to know Katrina's story. It takes less than 10 seconds, and it means everything. Now let's go back. To understand how Katrina Jefferies ended up on that hillside, wrapped in a tarpaulin, found by a stranger and a dog on a cold Tuesday morning, you have to understand who she was before that night. Not the version the headlines would later reduce her to. Not the shorthand of tabloid tragedy. You have to understand the actual texture of her life. The weight of it. Because there are cases where the victim exists in the story only as a body to be found. Katrina deserves more than that. She was born in 1982 or 1983, a daughter, a sister, a girl who grew up in Auckland's southern suburbs in the years when New Zealand felt smaller and tighter and less connected to the rest of the world. She was the kind of kid who had a laugh that people remembered. That detail, the laugh, the personality, the presence, those are the things that never make it into police reports. Those are the things that only the people who loved her still carry. Her mother, Nicola Jefferies, was the steady center of Katrina's life. They were close in the way that mothers and daughters sometimes become when the world outside the home is unstable. Nicola was the person Katrina turned to. The person she trusted. The person who would be left waiting. But Katrina's childhood was shadowed early. There were years of bullying in school that left marks that didn't show on the outside. She struggled to find her footing in a system that wasn't built for kids like her, kids who felt everything too much and had nowhere to put it. Eventually, she dropped out. It wasn't failure exactly. It was retreat. It was a young person deciding that the place causing her pain was better left behind. And then, when she was still a teenager, her brother drowned at sea. That detail, just 6 words, doesn't begin to capture what that kind of loss does to a family. Grief that arrives that suddenly, that finally, doesn't move through a person in a straight line. It sits. It changes the texture of everything that comes after. It rewrites the future. Katrina began drinking heavily. She began using drugs. She moved in circles where those things were available and where people didn't ask too many questions. In the Auckland suburbs of the mid-2000s, there were corners of community life that operated by different rules. People who knew people. Houses with open doors and no schedules. That world can feel like belonging when belonging is what you need most. At 19, Katrina became pregnant. And here is where the story shifts in a direction that matters. Because Katrina Jefferies was not just a young woman in difficult circumstances. She was a mother. Her son was born, and she loved him. She lived with Nicola in the family home on Whitmore Road in the Auckland suburb of Hillsborough. Her little boy was 20 months old when she died. 20 months. Just starting to walk properly. Just starting to learn the sounds that make words. Too young to remember her. Too young to know that the woman who loved him most in the world was already gone. That is the detail that doesn't let go. That 20-month-old boy would grow up without his mother's voice. He would have no memory of her face except through photographs. He would grow to adulthood in the shadow of an unanswered question that he never asked to carry. But on the evening of Sunday, July 10, 2005, none of that had happened yet. Katrina was alive. She was at home. Her son was there with Nicola. And at around 8 o'clock that night, Katrina Jefferies put on a black tracksuit, a white shirt, and burgundy shoes, and she walked out the front door. She told her mother she was going to the liquor store. She never came back. Nicola didn't immediately panic. That needs to be said carefully, and compassionately, because context matters here. Katrina's lifestyle meant that she sometimes stayed out. She sometimes went to parties. She sometimes didn't come home when expected. Nicola knew her daughter. She knew the patterns. She continued looking after her grandson through that night, and into the next day, not yet knowing, not yet able to know, that Katrina was already dead. That gap, the space between Katrina walking out the door and her body being found, is where this story lives. Approximately 48 hours. 2 nights. Somewhere in those 48 hours, a 22-year-old woman was killed. Her body was wrapped in tarpaulin and plastic. She was driven to a reserve less than a kilometre from her home. And she was left there, rolled partway down a slope, as if the person who put her there had run out of time, or nerve, or both. The question that would drive investigators for the next 20 years was not complicated in its structure. It was only complicated in the finding of its answer. Who did this? And what happened, in those 48 hours, that nobody was willing to say? Detective Senior Sergeant Jerry Whitley was one of the first senior investigators to speak publicly about the case. In the days after Katrina's body was discovered, he stood before reporters and said something that would define the investigation for years to come. He said the cause of death was highly unusual. He said they knew how she had died. He said, carefully and deliberately, that there was no weapon involved. And then he said the thing that lodged in the mind of everyone who heard it. Everything is not as it seems. That phrase. Sitting there like a locked room. He would not say more. He would not confirm whether she had been strangled. He would not release the toxicology results. He would not describe the nature of the injuries in any further detail. Everything is not as it seems. For words that told the public almost nothing, and yet told them everything they needed to understand that this was not a straightforward case of violence. Something unusual had happened to Katrina Jefferies. Something that the police believed was specific enough, strange enough, that revealing it might compromise their ability to find who did it. In 2011, 6 years after Katrina's body was found, Coroner Gordon Matenga presided over an inquest into her death. His finding was unambiguous. Katrina and Jefferies had suffered death at the hands of another person. It was homicide. It was murder. But even at the inquest, he suppressed the cause of death. He suppressed it specifically, deliberately, to protect the investigation. Because if the public knew exactly how she died, then the people who already knew, the people who were there, would know how much the police knew. And they might run. Or they might clean something up. Or they might rehearse a different story. So the coroner kept it sealed. And the cause of death stayed buried. This is the paradox at the heart of Operation Waikowhai. The investigators knew. They knew how she died. They had the evidence. They had the forensics. They had the coroner's conclusion. What they didn't have was a name. What they didn't have was someone they could place in the room. Someone who could be charged. Someone who could be tried. Hundreds of people were interviewed. More than 750, by the time the first phase of the investigation closed. 750 people who had some connection to Katrina, to her circle, to her neighborhood, to the locations relevant to the case. 750 conversations. And still, nothing that crossed the line from suspicion into evidence. There were false confessions. Multiple people, for reasons that are as disturbing as they are difficult to explain, contacted police and admitted to killing Katrina Jefferies. Each one had to be investigated. Each one consumed time and resources. Each one, when examined, turned out to be exactly what it appeared to be, a lie. Sometimes confused. Sometimes calculated. But none of them were the truth. Why do people falsely confess to murders? It's a question that forensic psychologists have studied for decades, and the answers are uncomfortable. Some people are seeking attention. Some are mentally unwell. Some, under pressure, come to believe a version of events that isn't real. And some are protecting someone. The false confessions in the Katrina Jefferies case were never explained publicly. But each one, when it collapsed, left the investigators back at the beginning. Back at the locked room. Back at the body on the hillside. In the meantime, the evidence found at the scene was doing what evidence does in unsolved cases. It sat in storage, waiting for someone to see it differently. The items found with Katrina's body were not random. That much was clear. Someone had wrapped her in a red tarpaulin. A specific tarpaulin, the kind used for covering outdoor furniture, for boats, for construction work. The yellow raincoat found with her was branded, it bore the label stormwear. It was a specific, purchasable, traceable item. There was a piece of marine plywood. There was a framed wooden picture. These things were not hers. These things came from somewhere. They came from someone. Police released images of the tarpaulin and the raincoat. They released images of the marine plywood and the framed picture, hoping that someone somewhere would recognize them. That someone would say, I know who owns a raincoat like that. That someone would say, I've seen that picture before. They did this publicly. They went through the press and through television. They made the items visible. And the silence that followed said something. Not nothing. Something. Marine plywood is the kind of material that turns up in certain environments. It's used in boat building. In construction. In cabinetry. It shows up in garages, in workshops, in the sheds of people who work with their hands or who spend time near the water. The Manukau harbor was less than 2 kilometers away. Waikowhai itself sat at the edge of the reserve that wound down toward the harbor foreshore. Someone who knew that area, who knew how to get down to the water, who was comfortable in the reserve, who knew which roads were quiet at what time, someone like that might keep marine plywood. Might have a car big enough to transport a body wrapped in tarpaulin without being noticed. The investigators looked at the crime scene from every angle they could. Katrina's body had been rolled partially down the bank. Just partially. It was visible from the path, to someone who looked closely enough. Which meant the person who put her there either didn't care if she was found, or ran out of time to push her further, or was interrupted. Investigators noted that she could have been hidden better. She could have been taken deeper into the reserve. She could have been weighed down and put in the harbor. Instead she was left in a spot that felt almost careless. Almost rushed. Criminal psychologist Katrina Jefferies, who consulted on the case, offered an analysis that shaped the investigation's direction. She suggested that the murder almost certainly did not take place at the reserve. The evidence, the wrapping, the transport, the use of a vehicle, pointed to Katrina being killed elsewhere, and her body being brought to Waikowhai afterward. She further suggested that the choice of location was not random. Someone chose Waikowhai specifically. Someone familiar with the area. Someone who knew it was sometimes used as a dump site. Someone who, in their mind, had already filed that place away as somewhere you could leave something and walk away from. That calculation, I know a place, is not the calculation of a stranger. That is the calculation of a local. And yet Katrina's body was left only 1 kilometer from her home. Think about that. 1 kilometer. 4 or 5 minutes by car. 10 minutes on foot. Whoever drove her there took almost no distance at all from the place where Katrina had been living her life. Either they didn't care. Or they were in too much of a hurry. Or the place they needed to get back to was also close. Very close. Investigators widened their interviews. They mapped her movements. They looked at everyone Katrina had known, everyone she had spent time with, everyone in that specific geography of South Auckland who intersected with her world. They knocked on doors. They sat in interview rooms. They ran the evidence through the lab again and again. 750 people. And the answer stayed somewhere in between them. But there was one more thing the investigators were sitting with. One detail that had never been made fully public until a 2019 television documentary changed the shape of the investigation. There was CCTV footage. A vehicle. Entering and leaving the Waikowhai area during the period when the body was being dumped. The image was captured, and it was released, grainy, taken from a distance, the kind of image that makes you lean closer to the screen and still can't give you certainty. A car. A time stamp. A direction of travel. And there was something else. A witness. Someone who had seen a shirtless man leaving a car near Waikowhai Road around the time that mattered. A shirtless man. In the middle of a New Zealand winter. Why was he shirtless? Why, in the cold, had he removed his shirt? Had he swapped it for something cleaner? Had his shirt been contaminated? Had it been left somewhere, or destroyed, as evidence of what had just been done? No one has ever publicly identified that man. And the car in the CCTV footage has never been definitively traced. There is a way that investigators learn to look at a crime scene. Not just at what is present, but at what is absent. Not just at what was done, but at the decisions embedded in what was done. Every choice a killer makes says something. The tarpaulin was a choice. The raincoat was a choice. The location was a choice. Even the partial rolling of the body down the bank, the incompleteness of it, was a choice, or the failure of one. Taken together, these choices sketch out a portrait. Not a face. Not a name. But a shape. The body had been wrapped with some deliberateness. The tarpaulin was not simply thrown over her. It was used to contain her. The rubbish bags were additional layers. The raincoat was there too, and its presence, a specific branded item, a stormwear PVC raincoat, the kind of thing someone might have in a garage or a vehicle for practical outdoor work, raised the question of whether it arrived at the scene already in the killer's possession, or whether it was put there to serve some other purpose entirely. Police at the time would not say whether the raincoat belonged to Katrina. What is known is that she left her home wearing a black tracksuit, a white shirt, and burgundy shoes. The yellow stormwear raincoat was not what she left home in. It came from somewhere else. It came from someone else. The framed wooden picture and the piece of marine plywood were also not Katrina's. Someone had brought them, perhaps as additional covering material, perhaps because they were simply items that were already in the vehicle being used. People who work in trades, construction, cabinetry, marine work, often have the back of their vehicle loaded with materials that accumulate over time. A piece of marine ply left over from a project. A framed thing being moved or discarded. These items could be mundane. Or they could be exactly the kind of specific, traceable detail that breaks a case open. Police released images of these items in 2019, 14 years after the murder, in conjunction with the TVNZ cold case documentary. The timing was deliberate. By then, the investigation had been officially reviewed twice. Operation Waikowhai had been the original investigation. Then, in 2014, Operation Lyra was launched, a full reinvestigation. And it was Operation Lyra that shook something loose. Not the murder itself, but something adjacent to it. Something that had been hiding in plain sight in the same streets, the same suburb, the same social geography where Katrina had lived her short life. Because in South Auckland in the early 2000s, there was a man people called Magic Mike. His real name was Michael Te Arawaka Te Huia. He was decades older than most of the people he spent his time with. He ran a backyard drinking and drug operation from his empty Roskill home, a kind of informal bar in the yard, always stocked, always open to the young people who gravitated there. He was the neighborhood tinny dealer. The person who could get you a drink, get you something stronger, get you whatever it was that made the night feel lighter than it actually was. The name Magic Mike reportedly came from the drink and drugs he supplied. The magic he could conjure. But people who knew him well, who were forced, eventually, to know him well, would have chosen different words entirely. Words like trap. Like predator. Like monster. He liked a certain type of girl. Young. Vulnerable. Preferably already disconnected from the kind of support network that might notice something was wrong. He would draw them in slowly. Friendship first. Warmth and generosity, the drinks flowing, the atmosphere easy. He was the cool older guy. The one who had connections. The one who let you feel grown up in a neighborhood where growing up had happened too fast for almost everyone. One neighbor, interviewed during Operation Lyra, was asked why young girls would spend time with someone like Michael Te Huia. Why a young woman would be in that yard, in that bar, when Te Huia was decades their senior and the dynamic so obviously lopsided. Why else would a pretty young girl hang out with a scary old man that looks like him, the neighbor said. To score weed from him. That line. The flatness of it. The sad, perfectly clear logic of it. And then, once the bond was formed, once the dependency was established, he changed. What had been charm became control. What had been generosity became entrapment. He had mongrel mob roots, and he used that background as a threat, as a wall, as a way of keeping people inside a situation they didn't know how to leave. His victims described waking up to find him already there. To find what had been done to them while they were unconscious. One of them described wearing layers to bed, jeans with a belt, multiple pairs of track pants, a hoodie tied tight, trying to make it harder for him to get to her. Trying to buy time. Trying to survive. This is not background detail. This is the world Katrina Jefferies moved through. Investigators working Operation Lyra interviewed women from MT Roskill and Hillsborough in the course of trying to build a picture of Katrina's last movements and associations. Those interviews, intended initially to shed light on Katrina's case, led in a direction that no one could have predicted. 3 women came forward. 3 separate women, with 3 separate histories of what Michael Te Arawaka Te Huia had done to them. Their accounts spanned 30 years. From the early 1980s, when his first known victim was 15 years old and he was 26, all the way through to the 2010s. In May 2016, Michael Te Huia was convicted of 21 charges of sexual and physical violence against those 3 women. He was sentenced to 19 years in prison by Justice Ailsa Duffy, who described his conduct as involving prolonged sexual and physical violence, carried out with a callous sense of entitlement. He would not be eligible for parole until he had served half his sentence. But here is where the story bends in a particular, painful direction. Those 21 convictions did not include the murder of Katrina Jefferies. The connection between Michael Te Huia and Katrina's death had been suppressed during the trial, a court order designed to stop the jury being prejudiced against him before they had heard all the evidence relating specifically to the 3 complainants. But after the verdict, after sentencing, the suppression order lapsed. And when it lapsed, what emerged was the confirmation that the reinvestigation of Katrina's murder, Operation Lyra, had been launched partly in the context of his name. Police have not publicly confirmed whether Te Huia is or was a suspect in Katrina's murder. That careful, deliberate silence is itself a statement. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't clear. It simply holds the question open in the space between knowing and proving. What is documented is this: Michael Te Huia lived in the same neighborhood as Katrina Jefferies. He operated in the same social world she moved through. He had a documented, systematic pattern of targeting vulnerable young women in that exact geography. He had been doing it for decades before Katrina died, and continued for years afterward. And when Operation Lyra began investigating Katrina's death, it eventually produced enough to charge him, not for what happened to her, but for what he had done to others. In the years following Te Huia's conviction, police reviewed all the evidence gathered across both operations Waikowhai and Lyra. Acting Detective Superintendent Paul Burrell completed the review in August 2018. That report was not released publicly. It was declined under the Official Information Act. But in his response to the Herald on Sunday, Detective Inspector Urea Vakaruru confirmed it had outlined some avenues of inquiry that the Auckland City Police were considering. Avenues. Plural. Still open. By 2019, the $50,000 reward that had been offered in 2007 had doubled to $100,000. Not just money, but immunity from prosecution for anyone who came forward with information that led to a conviction. Immunity. The police were not just asking for tips. They were offering protection to anyone who might have been there. Anyone who might have helped. Anyone who had spent 14 years carrying something they needed to put down. We know there are people out there who know what happened to Katrina, Detective Inspector Vakarura said. Relationships and loyalties change over time. Relationships and loyalties change over time. Someone who protected a killer in 2005 might not feel the same way in 2019. Might not feel the same way in 2025. Someone who was young then is middle-aged now. Life looks different. The calculations change. The things you were willing to stay quiet about when you were afraid, or loyal, or both, those things have a different weight after 20 years. The investigators were not giving up. They were still knocking on the same doors, just with different hands. To understand why Katrina Jefferies was so vulnerable on the night she disappeared, you have to understand what Sunday evenings felt like in Hillsborough in 2005. This was not the Auckland of the CBD, with its bars and its crowds and its ambient visibility. This was South Auckland. Quiet residential streets. Houses set back from the road. The kind of suburb where people knew their immediate neighbors but not necessarily anyone 3 streets over. The kind of suburb where, after dark in winter, the streets were empty fast. Katrina had left her son with her mother. She had told Nicola she was going to the liquor store. That statement, "I'm going to the liquor store," is the last documented piece of communication anyone had with her. It is ordinary. Domestic. The kind of thing said on the way out the door 100 times before. It is also, when you hold it up against everything that followed, unbearably sad. The liquor store was a short walk away. She should have been back within the hour. Perhaps within half an hour. She would have walked out the front gate of the Whitmore Road house, turned onto the street, and made her way through the neighborhood toward wherever she was headed. It was evening. Around 8 o'clock. The sun was already down. It was the middle of July, and Auckland winters are cold enough that you feel them. Not viciously cold. Not the kind of cold that takes your breath. But cold enough that being outside at night is something you do with purpose. Did she make it to the liquor store? Did she meet someone along the way? Did someone follow her, or were they waiting? These questions have never been publicly answered. There is no CCTV footage of her at the liquor store. There are no confirmed sightings of her after she left the house. The 48-hour window that opens at 8 p.m. on Sunday and closes when her body was found on Tuesday morning is a gap that investigators have circled for 20 years. It should be a trail. It should be a sequence of events. But it remains, at least publicly, a silence. What is known about that silence is this: Katrina was part of a social world that included people who moved around the neighborhood at night. She had connections to the local party scene. She had connections to people who could supply alcohol and drugs. Some of those people kept odd hours. Some of those people had reasons not to be seen or remembered. Some of those people, when police came knocking in the days after her body was found, had reasons to be careful about what they said. 750 interviews. And still, the silence. But there were the stories that began to surface later. The women who talked to investigators during Operation Lyra. Their accounts of what the social scene looked like, who was in it, who moved through it with a kind of gravitational authority. The backyard bar at Te Huia's MT Roscoe property. The open-door policy. The sense that you could always go there, that there would always be something on offer, that the welcome was warm even if what came after it wasn't. One of the women who gave evidence at Te Huia's trial had met him when she was a teenager. "I thought magic was cool as when I first met him," she said. "But later, when I got to know him, I was lured in, then he changed and turned into a monster." She had said that in a courtroom, in front of a jury, with his lawyers present. It had taken her years, decades, to get to the point where she could say it out loud in a room where it counted. How many other young women from that neighborhood had sat with something similar for just as long? The investigators who ran Operation Lyra understood that they were working in a community where silence had a structure to it. Where people knew things but didn't say them. Where the social rules, the loyalties, the fears, the debts, created a kind of enforced quiet that official pressure alone couldn't always break through. Police could knock on doors. They could sit across tables in interview rooms. They could offer money and immunity. But they couldn't undo the years of conditioning that told certain people, "You don't talk. You never talk." Especially not about what happened to Katrina. The psychological profile that emerged from consultation with experts during the investigation pointed in a specific direction. The murder itself, the cause of death described as highly unusual, no weapon used, the specific and deliberate nature of the wrapping and disposal, suggested someone with access to materials. Someone with a vehicle capable of transporting a body. Someone who had planned, at least minimally, for the possibility of having to get rid of evidence. The tarpaulin, the bags, the marine plywood, you don't pick those up on the way. You have them. You come prepared, or you use what's already in your possession. The body being left only partially concealed at Waikowhai Reserve suggested something about the state of mind of the person who put her there. If you have come prepared, if you have the tarpaulin, the bags, the materials, why not push her further down the slope? Why not take her somewhere more isolated? Why leave her somewhere that, in morning light, a dog and its owner would find her within days? The most likely explanation is time pressure. The most likely explanation is that something interrupted the process. A car going past. A light coming on somewhere. A noise. A fear. Something that said, go. Go now. Leave her and go. That detail tells you something important. The person who left Katrina Jefferies in Waikowhai Reserve was not operating with calm, methodical control. They were frightened. They were rushed. They were making decisions in the dark under pressure. That is the kind of state in which people make mistakes. In which people leave traces. In which something that seemed insignificant in the moment, a yellow raincoat, a piece of plywood, a frame, turns out to be exactly the thread that eventually unravels everything. The investigation identified that the reserve was known locally as a dump site. Not a formal council facility. Just a place where people left things they didn't want anymore. That knowledge, that cultural knowledge, that specific neighborhood familiarity, is not something a stranger would have. You don't drive into an unfamiliar suburb in the middle of the night and know exactly which road leads to a bank where things get left. You don't know the turn-off, the darkness of the path, the timing of when people usually walk there. You know those things because you live there. Because you've driven past 100 times. Because the geography of this suburb is the geography of your daily life. The killer was local. The investigators had always believed it. Everything about the scene confirmed it. Someone from Katrina's own streets had done this. And they had gone home afterward. Back to a house that was close. Back to a bed. Back to the ordinary machinery of a life that continued, inexplicably, while Katrina's stopped. When Nicola Jefferies finally understood that her daughter was not coming home, when the days passed and the absence became undeniable, she began to ask questions. She spoke to police. She gave everything she could. She was present at every stage of the investigation that families are permitted to be present at. She stood in front of cameras when police asked her to make public appeals. She said her daughter's name, over and over, in every context where it might reach the right ears. "We want justice for Katrina," she said in 2019. "It pains me that her killer is still out there somewhere." Her killer. Still out there somewhere. Living a life that Katrina couldn't. And there was something else Nicola carried, something that no legal process and no reward could ever address. Katrina's son had grown up. That 20-month-old boy was now a teenager, and then a young man, without ever knowing his mother. Without ever hearing her voice as more than a story told by someone else. Nicola raised him. She held the family together. She kept her daughter's memory alive in a home that had been fundamentally changed by one night in July 2005. If you are watching this and you are from the Auckland area, if you grew up in Hillsborough, or MT Roskill, or anywhere in the social orbit of this case, please stay with this. Because what comes next matters. And if it sparks something, please let it. In July 2014, Auckland police launched Operation Lyra. The decision to formally reinvestigate Katrina's murder was not made lightly. Reinvestigations of cold cases require resources that are always in competition with active investigations. They require investigators willing to return to evidence that has already been examined, already been turned over, already failed to produce a conviction, and look at it again without the assumption that the answer isn't there. They require a particular kind of stubbornness. A particular kind of belief that the case is solvable. The detective who eventually led the Operation Lyra reinvestigation was brought in with fresh eyes. The existing Operation Waikowhai files, Hundreds of interview transcripts, forensic reports, CCTV analysis, everything accumulated across 9 years of investigation, were reopened. Every thread that had been pulled and gone nowhere was re-examined to ask whether it had actually gone nowhere, or whether it had been followed far enough. What Operation Lyra found, in the process of doing that work, was not simply new evidence in Katrina's case. It was the women. The 3 women who had been living in that same neighborhood, in that same social landscape, carrying accounts of what Michael Te Huia had done to them across 3 decades. They came forward in the context of Operation Lyra. Their courage, and it was courage, because of what it cost them to speak, led directly to the charges that would eventually see Te Huia sentenced to 19 years. But the relationship between those revelations and Katrina's murder is the part the police have never publicly resolved. Here is what is confirmed: Te Huia lived in the same neighborhood as Katrina Jefferies. He had a documented pattern of targeting young, vulnerable women in exactly her demographic. He had operated in the same social spaces she moved through. Operation Lyra, the reinvestigation of her murder, was the mechanism through which he was ultimately charged with the crimes against the other 3 women. Police have explicitly declined to confirm or deny whether he was a suspect in her death. And the internal review completed by Acting Detective Superintendent Paul Burrell in 2018, the review that examined all evidence from both operations, was refused under the Official Information Act. That is not nothing. That accumulation of careful non-confirmation is not the same as clearing someone. What it means, in practical terms, is that there are investigators who know more than has ever been made public. There is a review report that exists, that was completed, that identified avenues of inquiry. There is a case file in Auckland that has Katrina's name on it, and that file has not been closed. Not in 2007. Not in 2011. Not in 2016. Not in 2019. Not now. The question that sits at the center of the investigation, the specific, forensic, controlled question of cause of death, was addressed at the coroner's inquest in November 2011. Coroner Gordon Matenga heard the evidence. He examined what the police knew. And he made 2 findings. The first was that Katrina and Jefferies had suffered death at the hands of another. Murder. The second was that the specific manner of death should be suppressed. Suppressed. Not absent. Not unknown. Known, and protected. That suppression was not about shielding the public from something disturbing. It was a strategic legal decision designed to preserve the integrity of any future prosecution. Because if the cause of death were made public, then the person responsible would know exactly how much the police had. They would know which questions to prepare for. They would know which lies needed to be most carefully constructed. By keeping it sealed, the investigation retained an asymmetry. The investigators knew something that the killer believed was known only to them. Detective Senior Sergeant Jerry Whitley had said it plainly back in 2005, there was no weapon. Whatever had been done to Katrina Jefferies, it had been done with hands, or a body, or some combination of physical force that didn't require a tool that could be separately identified. That narrows it. It takes the vast, diffuse space of possible methods and collapses it into something smaller. Something more personal. Something that required proximity. Something that required the killer to be close to her, to be in contact with her, to have made a decision in a moment of physical closeness that could not be undone. That is a particular kind of violence. It is not the clinical distance of a weapon fired from across a room. It is something that happened in the space between 2 people. Something that required the killer to remain present while Katrina Jefferies died. Think about who can do that. Think about what kind of person can stay in the room. Then think about who the police have spent 20 years quietly, methodically circling. The CCTV footage that was released publicly for the first time in the 2019 Cold Case documentary showed a vehicle. The footage was not high resolution. It captured a car entering and leaving the Waikowhai area during the relevant window of time, the hours between Katrina's disappearance on Sunday night and the discovery of her body on Tuesday morning. Police released stills from the footage with the documentary in the hope that someone watching would recognize the vehicle. That is not a small thing. A vehicle is specific. A make, a model, a registration, those narrow the field dramatically. The fact that police released the footage suggests they believe it is significant. The fact that no arrest has followed suggests either that the vehicle was not definitively traced, or that the vehicle alone was not sufficient to build a case. There was also the witness. The person who saw a shirtless man leaving a car near Waikowhai Road at a time consistent with the disposal of the body. A shirtless man, in a New Zealand winter, standing near a vehicle in a place where a young woman had just been left in the dark. Why no shirt? That question has been asked in virtually every analysis of this case, and the most coherent answer is also the most disturbing one. If a shirt, or any piece of clothing, had been contaminated during the killing or the transportation of the body, removing it would be logical. If there was blood, or other biological material that could be forensically significant, you wouldn't want to be wearing that evidence. You would get rid of it. Or you would leave it in the car, and take it somewhere else later. Which means that somewhere, in the days after July 10, 2005, a piece of clothing may have been destroyed. Or discarded. Or buried. Or burned. And the person who did that knows exactly what they did and why. That person has lived with it for 20 years. There are cases that investigators call solvable. Not solved. Not broken open. Solvable. The difference between the two is not just evidence. It is the gap between what is known and what can be proven. In Katrina Jefferies' case, the investigators have said this explicitly. They believe it can be solved. They believe the answer exists in the community. They believe someone is carrying information that they have not yet released. We believe this is a solvable case, Detective Inspector Vakaruru said in 2019. We know there are people out there who have vital information which will result in identifying those involved. Identifying those involved. Plural. Not those responsible. Those involved. That word choice, involved, is not casual. It suggests a possible understanding that more than one person may have been present during the crime or the disposal of the body. It suggests that the information the investigators are seeking may be distributed across more than one person's memory. That 2, or 3, or more people are sitting with pieces of a picture they have never assembled in public. This is not an uncommon dynamic in homicide investigations. The person who commits a murder is rarely the only person with knowledge of it afterward. Bodies have to be moved. Vehicles have to be borrowed. Alibis have to be coordinated. People notice things and are asked not to talk about them. The social infrastructure of an unsolved crime is often more extensive than the lone perpetrator narrative suggests. In South Auckland in 2005, there was a social infrastructure already in place that was built around silence. Michael Te Huia's world, the backyard bar, the tinnies, the young women drawn in and trapped, was a world that operated precisely because of silence. Because people saw and said nothing. Because the social calculus of that neighborhood, at that time, said that you minded your own business. Because there were real, physical consequences for talking to the wrong person about the wrong thing. The man who called himself the King of Roskill. The man who made threats about what happened to people who stepped out of line. The man who continued what he was doing for 30 years because no one, until 3 brave women in 2014, was willing to stand up in a room where it counted and say his name. Is it possible that the same culture of silence that protected Te Huia across 30 years of violence also protected Katrina's killer across 20? Police have never confirmed this. They have never drawn this line explicitly in public. But the geography is undeniable. The overlap is real. The chronology places these events in the same streets, the same social networks, the same world. And there is something else worth sitting with. Among the 750 people interviewed across the 2 investigations, there were people who gave police something, some fragment, some partial truth, but not everything. There are people who told investigators a version of what they knew but left the most important part out. That is a common dynamic in investigations of this type. People give you just enough to feel like they've said something. Not enough to put themselves in danger. Not enough to actually answer the question. The person or people who know what happened to Katrina on the night of July 10, 2005 may have already spoken to police. May have already sat across a table, made eye contact, answered questions. And kept the one thing that matters most locked behind their eyes. By 2019, the $100,000 reward came with something additional. Immunity from prosecution. The police weren't just offering money, they were offering a way out. For anyone who had been present, had been involved in a peripheral way, had helped with the transportation or the disposal without having committed the murder themselves, there was now a legal mechanism that could, under the right conditions, protect them. Come forward. Tell us what you know. And we will consider what that means for you. That is an extraordinary offer. It is also an offer that changes the moral calculation for anyone sitting with guilty knowledge. Because if you can come forward and receive immunity, then staying silent is no longer about self-preservation. Staying silent, at that point, is a choice made purely for the benefit of the person who killed Katrina Jefferies. The offer was publicized. The TVNZ cold case documentary aired nationally. Nicola Jefferies spoke. Detectives spoke. The case was front page and prime time in New Zealand for several days. And then the news cycle moved on, as it does. The current events overtook the cold case. The cameras left. The documentaries moved to other stories. But the investigation didn't close. It never closed. In 2014, a 54-year-old man was identified, not named publicly, following interviews conducted during Operation Lyra. He was charged with unrelated criminal offenses based on complaints from 3 women who came forward during the reinvestigation. That man was Michael Te Huia. The charges were unrelated to Katrina's murder. But they were born from the same investigation. They were born from the same questions being asked in the same streets where she had lived and died. His victims at trial described what it was like to be in his orbit. The charm first. The generosity. The way he made you feel seen, chosen, special, until you were already in too deep to walk away easily. Then the control. The violence. The waking up to find him already there. One of them described him as someone who believed, genuinely and completely, that he was entitled to whatever he wanted. That the rules that applied to other people did not apply to him. That the women in his world existed for his use. He depicted himself in high regard, a probation officer wrote in a pre-sentencing report. This demonstrated more as him having an inflated sense of self-worth and entitlement. The judge sentenced him to 19 years. Half to be served before parole eligibility. She described his conduct across 30 years as prolonged, deliberate, and carried out with a callousness that was present even in the courtroom. He had sat through the trial maintaining his innocence. He had not expressed remorse. He had, according to the probation report, told the writer that he forgave his accusers, as if forgiveness were his to grant. "I feel sorry for them, I forgive them," he said. Somewhere in South Auckland, a woman named Nicola Jefferies was still waiting for someone to forgive something far more significant. Her daughter had been 22 years old. She had been walking to a liquor store in a suburb she had lived in her whole life. She had a son who was 20 months old and a mother who loved her. She had a laugh that people remembered. She had a life that was difficult and marked by grief and still, by every measure that matters, entirely worth living. Whatever happened in that 48-hour window happened to a real person who deserved more than a tarpaulin and a hillside and 2 decades of unanswered questions. The investigation continues. The reward stands. The immunity offer remains available, as of the last confirmed public statement from Auckland Police. If you've been watching this and something has stirred, if a detail here matches something you've known, or half known, or suspected, then the number to call is the New Zealand Police non-emergency line, 105. Or you can report anonymously through Crime Stoppers on 0800 555 111. There is a thing that happens in long-running unsolved cases that investigators understand and families live. It is the accumulation of anniversaries. The 1st year. The 5th. The 10th. The 14th, when police finally doubled the reward and went back to television to ask the public again. Each anniversary is a reminder that someone got away with it for another year. Each birthday that Katrina's son marks without her is another year of debt. Nicola Jefferies has carried this for 20 years. That sentence is technically accurate and completely inadequate. What it means to carry a thing like this for 20 years, the daily weight of not knowing, the specific torture of knowing that someone knows and isn't saying, the vigilance required to remain hopeful enough to keep asking, that is not something a sentence can hold. She has been present at every public appeal. She has spoken when police asked her to speak. She has stood in front of cameras and said her daughter's name and described what justice would mean to her family. And she has continued raising her grandson, the boy who is now a young adult, in the home where Katrina grew up. The home on Whitmore Road where the last documented words between a mother and a daughter were an ordinary thing about a liquor store. In 2007, 2 years after the murder, police launched the first public reward. $50,000. Hundreds of tips came in. Each one was investigated. Each one was followed through to wherever it led. None of them led to a charge. In 2011, the coroner's inquest. Murder confirmed. Cause of death suppressed. That legal confirmation, the official, documented ruling that Katrina was killed by another person, was both necessary and insufficient. It named what happened. It didn't name who did it. And naming who did it is the only thing that would actually change anything for Nicola, for Katrina's son, for the investigators who have spent pieces of their careers on this case. In 2014, Operation Lyra. The reinvestigation. 40 detectives at points during the inquiry. Hundreds of new interviews. And from those interviews, unexpectedly, 3 women and the prosecution that put Michael Te Huia behind bars for 19 years. The detective in charge of Operation Lyra described the review of the Operation Waikowhai files as revealing good work done in the original investigation. They had built on it. They had found new avenues. In 2016, Te Huia was sentenced. And the suppression order linking his prosecution to the investigation into Katrina's death was lifted. The New Zealand media was able to report, for the first time, that the reinvestigation of Katrina's murder had been the mechanism that exposed him. The 2 cases were connected, not in evidence, not in charges, but in the investigative thread that ran from a hillside in Hillsborough to a backyard bar in Mt. Roskill. Police declined to say whether Te Huia was a suspect in her death. They declined to provide the review report. They described ongoing avenues of inquiry. They did not close the case. Then, in 2018, Detective Superintendent Andy Lovelock, who had most recently led a major $5 million investigation into a high-profile case involving 1080 poison blackmail, was assigned to oversee the review of all evidence from Operations Waikowhai and Lyra. The scale of that investment signals something. When you put a senior detective of that caliber on a review of a cold case, you are not signaling that the case is dead. You are signaling that you believe there is something in the files that hasn't yet been fully exploited. Something that a fresh set of experienced eyes might see differently. What Lovelock found has not been publicly disclosed. What came next publicly was the July 2019 cold case documentary and the doubling of the reward to $100,000. New CCTV stills. Released for the first time. Images of items found at the scene, the yellow stormwear raincoat, the red tarpaulin, shown in detail for the first time publicly. Nicola speaking on camera. Investigators speaking on camera. The number to call repeated at the end. And then, in the months that followed, there was the silence again. Silence is not the same as stasis. The investigators are still working. Cold cases are never formally closed in New Zealand. The files remain active. New forensic technologies continue to develop, and evidence that could not be fully analyzed in 2005 or 2014 may be analyzable now. DNA recovery from degraded samples has advanced significantly in the last decade. Touch DNA, genetic material left by simple physical contact, can now be retrieved from surfaces that would have been considered exhausted years ago. The tarpaulin. The raincoat. The marine plywood. The framed picture. These items have been in the possession of investigators for 20 years. They have been tested. But they may not have been tested with the most current methodologies. And the advance of forensic science is one of the most consistent mechanisms through which cold cases eventually break. There is also the passage of time itself as a factor in the social calculus of people with knowledge. A person who was 25 years old in 2005 is 45 today. The loyalties that held at 25 may not hold at 45. The fears that kept them quiet when they were young and in that world may have diminished as their life moved in a different direction. People leave. People change. People have children of their own, and the idea of someone doing to their child what was done to Katrina changes the calculation in ways that simple time alone cannot. The investigators who worked this case have said it. Relationships and loyalties change. They have watched it happen in other cases. They have seen people come forward years, even decades, after the fact, not because new evidence forced their hand, but because they couldn't carry it anymore. Because the weight of knowing had finally become heavier than the weight of speaking. Te Huia is in prison. If anyone who was part of his world, who was present that night or in the days surrounding Katrina's death, has stayed silent partly out of proximity to him, partly out of the culture of silence he maintained for 30 years, then his imprisonment changes their situation. He is not in the neighborhood. He is not going to come to the door. The threat that existed in that world, at that time, is now behind a prison wall. The immunity offer remains. $100,000 and protection from prosecution. For information that leads to a conviction. That is the shape of where this case stands as of the most recent public information available. Not closed. Not solved. But not forgotten, either. Not by the investigators. Not by Nicola. Not by Katrina's son, now an adult, who grew up knowing that somewhere in the suburb where he lived there was a person who took his mother from him before he could even remember her face. Not by anyone who has watched this far. There is a version of this story that has a clean ending. A detective receiving a call. A tip that finally holds together. An interview that breaks differently from all the interviews that came before it. A charge. A trial. A jury. A verdict. Nicola in the gallery, watching the person responsible for her daughter's death being held accountable in a room built for exactly that purpose. That version has not happened. Not yet. What has happened is 20 years of an investigation that refused to die, in a case involving a 22-year-old woman who was found wrapped in a tarpaulin and left on a hillside less than a kilometre from her home, and whose killer has never been charged. What has happened is Nicola Jefferies getting older in the same suburb, holding the same unanswered question, raising a grandson who deserved to know his mother and never got the chance. What has happened is Michael Te Arawaka Te Huia, Magic Mike, the neighborhood predator, the tinny dealer, the self-styled king of Roskill, being convicted of 21 counts of sexual and physical violence against 3 women over 30 years, and sentenced to 19 years in prison, while the investigation into Katrina's death remains officially open. What has happened is a case that has produced 2 formal investigations, more than 750 interviews, multiple false confessions, a coroner's finding of homicide, a suppressed cause of death, a doubled reward, immunity from prosecution, CCTV footage released to the public, physical evidence from the scene shown nationally on television, and not a single charge. The shape of that record is not failure. It is the shape of an investigation working against a conspiracy of silence. Against a social world that had rules about what you said and didn't say, and enforced those rules with fear. Against a killer, or killers, who either had enough control over their environment to prevent witnesses from speaking, or enough luck that the right witnesses weren't there to begin with. But silence has a lifespan. And 20 years is long enough that the lifespan of the silence surrounding Katrina Jefferies' murder is running out. Let's go back to the beginning one more time. Not to the hillside. Not to the body. To Katrina herself. She was a young woman who had been through things that would have bent many people past recovery. She had lost her brother to the sea. She had been bullied out of school. She had started using substances to navigate a grief and a loneliness that had no other outlet. She had become pregnant at 19 in circumstances that weren't ideal, and she had still loved her son. She had still been there. She had still come home to Nicola's house on Whitmore Road every night, most nights, with her little boy's toys on the floor and her mother in the kitchen and the ordinary machinery of family life carrying on around her. She was not a perfect person. No person is. She was a 22-year-old trying to keep her head above water in a world that had not been kind to her, in a suburb that had beauty in it and danger in it and people who loved her and people who, eventually, did not. She left the house on a Sunday evening in July and she told her mother she was going to the liquor store. And somewhere between that door and wherever she ended up, something happened. Someone made a decision. And Katrina Jefferies died. Her son has grown up. He is now in his early 20s. He has, in all likelihood, grown up knowing the outline of his mother's story, the newspaper articles, the documentaries, the reward poster. He has lived his whole life with that story as a given, a background fact about who he is. He never chose to be the child left behind. He never chose to grow up without a voice, a laugh, a face that belongs to him and not just to photographs. Nicola has said, publicly and without ambiguity, that she wants justice. That she knows Katrina's killer is out there. That she hopes someone who knows something will eventually do what's right. Doing what's right has never been more achievable than it is now. The infrastructure for speaking is in place. The mechanisms are available. Crime Stoppers, 0800555111, allows completely anonymous reporting. The immunity offer from Auckland Police remains on the table as of their last confirmed public statements. $100,000 for material information leading to a conviction. The case is still active. The investigators are still reviewing. What the case needs is a human decision. One person deciding that 20 years is long enough. That the loyalty or fear or silence they've maintained isn't worth another 20 years of the same. That Katrina's son, now an adult, deserves to know. That Nicola, now older and still waiting, deserves to know. That the weight of what happened on that Sunday night in July 2005 belongs on the person who caused it, and not on everyone else who has been carrying pieces of it ever since. Someone remembers something about that night. A car. A voice. A detail that felt small at the time. A question someone asked them not to answer. A thing they saw through a window or from a driveway or from a car parked on the wrong street at the wrong hour. Something that has sat in a particular place in their memory for 20 years, not quite forgettable, not quite speakable. That detail is the thing this case has been waiting for. If it's you, if you're watching this and something has shifted, please make the call. The number is 0800-555-1111 for Crime Stoppers, fully anonymous. Or contact Auckland Police directly. For Nicola. For her grandson. For a 22-year-old in a black tracksuit and burgundy shoes who walked out a door in July and never came back. And if you've watched this far, thank you. Genuinely. The fact that you're still here, that Katrina's story held you for this long, matters. Because every view, every share, every comment keeps her name alive in a world that moves fast and forgets easily. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Like the video so others can find it. Share it, not just for the algorithm, but because the right person might be watching in someone's social feed who wouldn't have found it otherwise. The right person might be someone's uncle, someone's neighbor, someone they grew up with who needs to see this. Leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, what you thought, what stayed with you. Your engagement is not a small thing. It is how cases like Katrina's stay visible. It is how pressure stays on the people who need to feel it. Somewhere in Auckland, someone knows exactly what happened on the night of July 10, 2005. They know where she went. They know who she was with. They know what was done to her and why she was carried to a hillside less than 1 kilometre from her home and left there wrapped in a tarpaulin. For 20 years, they have lived with that. The question is whether they will carry it for 20 more. Katrina and Jefferies. 22 years old. Mother of 1 daughter. Born in Auckland. Found in the bush she probably grew up playing near. Deserving of justice that has not yet arrived. Her case is open. Her story is not over. And somewhere, the person who can change that is still breathing.